All right, are you guys familiar with that urban myth that if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it will instantly leap out? But if you put it in a pot filled with pleasantly tepid water and gradually heat it, the frog will remain in the water until it boils to death. Well, that is a fitting metaphor for our democracy right now. As our democratic norms erode within America, we must wonder, will this democracy survive? Well, a Yahoo News poll says no. But perhaps when you build a nation on stolen land with stolen labor, it was never going to be a republic we could keep. So let's talk about the possible fall of democracy and what, if anything, can be done to keep it. Elie Mystal is back with me, and joining the panel is Sarah Kendzior, author of Hiding in Plain Sight and co-host of the podcast Gaslit Nation, and the nemesis heard around the world, Dr. Jason Johnson, MSNBC political contributor and professor of journalism and politics at Morgan State University. Glad to have you all here. This is such a wild time that we live in. Jason, I'm going to bring you in first here because you and I have talked about this a lot. We'll pick up the conversation on our live later, but how likely is a civil war in this country? Because in 10 years, I just wonder if the United States will still be united, because it's not looking so likely. And what should we be considering when we're thinking about the lead up to whatever is going to happen?
So this is the thing I need people to understand so that they don't think we're being hyperbolic, right? A civil war in the way that we see it in the United States is, oh, North versus South, and, you know, and red versus gray, and you know, books and stuff like that. That's not how all civil wars operate. In many countries, a civil war manifests itself by having large sections of the country that cannot be managed or controlled by the central government, right? That is something that is possible in the United States. There are sections of this country that, look, right now, the Bundy Ranch was an offshoot, right? But we have sections of this country right now where white nationalists and militant groups and stuff like that are beginning to train, beginning to expand. They're beginning to get political leaders in office who don't want to listen to the federal government. So in 10, 12 years, heck, in 4 years, if we have a legislature in Georgia or Iowa or Nebraska or something else like that that says we no longer recognize the validity of the Joe Biden administration, that is sort of a precursor for civil war. That's what happens when you have within a civil society a lack of agreement on who's actually running the country. So it's not as far-fetched as people think. And I think the country needs to understand that it doesn't always have to look the way it has in the past to be something dangerous for our future.
Right. And, you know, I think you make a good point, Jason, because, Sarah, I want to ask you, there are things happening around us every single day that people are just going about their lives and not necessarily noticing, hey, the water temperature is almost boiling at this point. What are some warning signs that are happening in society right now that is foreshadowing the potential fall of American democracy?
Well, what we're going through now is a culmination. It is not something new. It has been building to this point for years and for decades. I think the fact that we have an unpunished, seditious, violent attack on the Capitol 18 months later, that's finally being addressed through hearings and has not been addressed by the DOJ in terms of targeting the elite operatives who organized it. That's a giant warning sign. The attack on voting rights, the attack on civil rights, and also a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing about the quote unquote civil war, that people have these romantic, very misguided fantasies about. There is no such thing as a red state or a blue state. As I've said many times, America is purple. It is purple like a bruise. These categories were created by political operatives during the 2000 highly contested presidential election. And people who are greedy, people who want to strip this country down and sell it off for parts, are weaponizing these categories now by presenting very complicated states full of a diverse array of people, full of cities and rural areas and just, you know, a multitude of Americas within each state as these hardened, immutable entities. They want a situation akin to what happened to Yugoslavia, to the fall of Yugoslavia and the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. That's the kind of chaos and exploitation of that chaos that they crave. And so it's very important that Americans stand united. That does not mean denying our problems. It means confronting them head on for the benefit of all, because all this talk about civil war or secession or blue paradises or red paradises, it is fatuous. It is going to hurt every ordinary American citizen. It is only going to benefit the criminal elite.
And speaking of the criminal elite, Ellie, Sarah just made some really good points. You know, you and I have talked about how there is the legislative branch of this country that's failing. There's also the judicial branch of this country. We're looking at very different justice systems play out for people. I know there's a lot of frustration around what the DOJ is doing and pursuing when it comes to January 6th. And I wonder, people who have committed much lighter crimes that did not try to overthrow the government, as they look at this justice system play out not in their favor, how incentivized would they be to help save this democracy when their interaction with the state is very different from what upper crust white privileged people experience?
A civil war implies two sides fighting. Why would the MAGA side fight when they've already captured the courts? I mean, I get to course correct now on live television because you want to talk about a person who also has been on Merrick Garland from the very beginning. It is Sarah, right to my right. Like, she has been on it. And one of the reasons why she has been on it is that Sarah and I and Jason, we understand that when these people take control of the courts, they don't have to go to the street fighting. We have a case coming up in the Supreme Court next term that will legalize, and this is what people need to understand about what they're going to do. It will all be legal. What the insurrection, if you want to call it, the war, the authoritarian takeover of our nation will be made legal by the Supreme Court. And when you see the, shall we say, tepid reaction to the court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, when you see the willingness of people to just accept Supreme Court pronouncements without fighting back, what you see is everything in place for the court to retroactively give the imprimatur of legitimacy to any civil insurrection or authoritarian takeover of our government. They're not going to need to fight. They're gonna have everything in place to do it legally.
But Ellie, I want to stick with you here because you're saying, why would they fight? And yes, some will have the opportunity to do it legally, but there's also just when it gets taken to the streets. You know, I mean, one side is far out armored compared to the rest of us. And I do think that we could see droves of political violence happen just like we saw on January 6th, particularly when you think about those state legislatures that are not as protected as the U.S. Capitol. So when it comes to I do wonder what that looks like.
I just finished reading Malcolm Nance's new book, They Want to Kill Americans. I know Jason Johnson has had Malcolm on his podcast.
He's coming
recently.
up on this show. He'll be on this show at the top of the 11, so stay tuned.
It's scary.
Yeah.
He lays out the scary scenario for insurrection in our country. So, yes, I do think that is also the street level fighting is also a possibility. It's also something to be worried about. But again, if somebody comes and busts me up, the question is, will anybody hold that person accountable? Will the district attorney or the attorney general or the Supreme Court hold these people accountable if they attack me and my community? And so far, the answer consistently has been no. And that to me is the most terrifying problem.
Yeah. All right. This is too much to talk about in this segment, so I'm going to ask all of you guys to stick around because I want to dive deeper into what it means to save this democracy. Elliot, Sarah, and Jason will be back, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after this break. All right. My panel is back with me. Let's get right into it. Jason, I wanted to ask you about this all week because when I saw Dr. Joe Biden's remarks referencing the Latino community, it did get me thinking about the relation between that and trying to save this democracy. And I'm not here to beat up on Joe Biden, but I did think about the Latino community, one of the biggest voting bloc in this country among eligible voters, not registered voters, and how that must feel. And there consistently seems to be so much focus on the people who helps erode this democracy, intentionally or unintentionally, and not on the rising majority of people who have consistently, time and again, helped save it, like black folks, like brown folks, like progressive, people who are not of color, like the API community, indigenous folks. Why is that? And how do we shift that conversation to say, hey, dance with the one who brung you, because we're the people on the front lines fighting this fight every day and saving this place?
So me and Ellie and Sarah are all sort of in cahoots on these sorts of conversations online. So I'm going to bring up something Sarah mentioned earlier this week. There's a difference between your base and your voters, right? It seems like in many instances, the current Democratic Party's base are their big donors and corporations and a certain level of older elites, and they're ignoring the actual voters, you know, the people who actually put you in power one way or another. And that's why you see a sort of lack of effort when it comes to voting rights. That's where you see a lack of effort when it comes to issues like immigration. That's where you see a lack of effort on the issues that matter most to the people who actually have to fight through suppression to put you in office. But I want to say this because this is sort of encapsulating this whole conversation we're having about democracy. It's not popular to say, lots of people don't want to admit it, but this current administration has failed at almost every single level, and I had a conversation with Malcolm Nance on my podcast about this. They failed at almost every single level in facing this ongoing insurgency. There is not one country you can name in history that has a former leader that led an insurrection against the government who ain't in jail by now. I mean, there's other countries where they would have done worse, but there's no country you can name in history that allows someone who tried to take over the government to continue to hang out and party in a state as if nothing ever happened. And when you have Adam Schiff, who's in charge of the January 6th committee, saying, we don't know what's going on with Merrick Garland, how is it that we in Congress have talked to witnesses that the Department of Justice hasn't called yet, and they have a much bigger bat than we do? That is what we need. It's not just a failure to serve your voters. It's not just serving the base over the voters. It's a failure to protect this country. And this leadership has failed at almost every single level. And no matter how many of resistance Twitter says that we should wait longer and longer for Merrick Garland, it's pretty clear that the clock has already struck 12, and this guy is not at work.
Yeah, and just to be clear, look, I think there's a lot of legitimacy there. People always say, all you guys do is beat up on the Democrats. Look, that's not the case here. You know, I'm here to sound the alarm that if Republicans were to take control of this government, things would escalate to a much scarier level very quickly. So please do go vote. Nobody is saying anything other than that right here. Please understand that. But Jason brought up a very legitimate point about the failures of this administration, and for the people who said, yeah, we did that already. We voted already, and now you won't even protect our right to do that. So what now? I think one interesting thing about all this, Sarah, is a lot of this organizing and a lot of, I almost want to call it people being hypnotized. It takes place on social media. I'm not trying to give people a pass, but I do want you to take a listen to one of the insurrectionists who testified before the January 6th committee about how he was essentially brainwashed. I'll talk about that on the other side, but how he was essentially brainwashed into believing some of these ridiculous theories. Take a listen.
I was, you know, pretty hardcore into the social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I followed, you know, President Trump, you know, on all of the websites, you know. He basically put out, you know, come to Stop the Steal rally, you know, and I felt like I needed to be down here.
So, Sarah, I'm not giving this guy a pass. You know, my little Instagram filtered thirst traps that I post do not make me believe I'm a size 6. Like, I know the difference between real life and social media. So I'm wondering why this guy doesn't, and what role you think social media plays in the erosion of our democracy.
And social media played an enormous role in January 6th, and we watched them recruit these insurrectionists online. We watched this process play out. We watched Trump call for them to appear, Michael Flynn call for them to appear, Stone, Bannon, Lynn Wood. This all happened in plain sight, and for months, people were watching this slow-rolling, ongoing coup, wondering, when is somebody going to stop it? When is somebody going to take it seriously? And now, officials feign shock to avoid accountability. During the second impeachment of Donald Trump, the impeachment committee relied entirely on public domain evidence because there was so much of it online, and it was on television, and it was live streamed on the internet. So it's this really mind-boggling thing that the DOJ and the FBI, for that matter, seem to have to struggle or claim that they cannot find enough evidence or they need to find these new witnesses. The perpetrators confessed the crimes. The people who were recruited in the open, and they often showed some hesitancy. They were asking people like Lynn Wood, hey, you know, should we really do this? This seems kind of risky. And he was like, yes, you know, you should. They made hotel reservations online. They wore matching January 6th Civil War t-shirts. Like, this was not an ambiguous attempted coup. This was not ambiguous sedition, but there has been nothing done to the elite operators, or for that matter, to members of Congress who encouraged it, including my senator, Josh Hawley, and also a large number of Republicans in the House. That's absolutely disastrous. You cannot go on pretending that everything is normal. You cannot have a kumbaya moment with a mafia syndicate. You cannot negotiate with an authoritarian cult, and you cannot reach across the aisle to people who want to shoot you in the face. And it's about time that the Biden administration recognized that and acted on it. And if the DOJ is not going to do it, then they need to do something about Merrick Garland, or at least explain to the public what is going on, because it's our country. It is our country, and we deserve to know.
Absolutely, and many of us are not looking for a kumbaya moment with bigots. Thank you, guys. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Ellie, for sticking around all morning and being here with us, and Sarah Kendzior. And Jason, don't you go anywhere, because you're staying with us for the next block.